Senator Schumer said on the Senate floor yesterday, all the Democrats are cool with ending this on Friday. Now Senator Feinstein says, no, we need to take longer. How is that not moving the goalposts?
Well, I think the allegations are serious enough, the stakes are high enough that a thorough investigation should be conducted. If they can do that by tomorrow, then, bring it up for a vote. But if they can't do that, an artificial deadline, I think, really brings into jeopardy the credibility of the court. We don't want a justice on there with asterisks next to his name because there's all these lingering questions.
But it wasn't an artificial deadline when Democrats were originally calling for an FBI investigation and said a week would be okay. So why is it artificial now?
Well, I think they suspected, or they hoped that a week-long investigation would interview all of the witnesses. When you hear that NBC is reporting 40 witnesses have not yet been interviewed, that sounds like, a rush to get this done when there's really no reason that it has to be done by Friday.
Would you be comfortable, though, with this Friday deadline if this investigation ends Friday? Are you cool with that? Should Democrats be okay with that?
No, not if there are witnesses who can go to Judge Kavanaugh's credibility or even Dr. Ford's credibility. Those witnesses should be interviewed, and also other named victims who have come forward should be interviewed.
So would you put a cap on it at all?
I would say follow the evidence. The FBI, they're experts in this, but if they are limited in what they can do, then again, now you're putting the FBI right in the middle of an election. Their credibility is going to be on the line. That's not fair to them.
President Trump, speaking of credibility, went after Christine Blasey Ford. He called her originally a very fine woman, very credible. Here's what he had to say at this rally overnight in Mississippi.
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know.
Your reaction?
He's the leader of the United States. It's disgusting that he would say that about any sexual assault victim. But what is even more disgusting are that people in Congress, Republicans, have really mostly said zero. Thank God Susan Collins spoke up, but I'd like to hear others, because it doesn't matter what your politics are. We should all condemn someone who attacks a sexual assault survivor.
Is there concern when you talk about the political piece of this, when you look at some new polling that's out showing in certain states there is increasing support? It is, Kellyanne commented, firing up conservatives, the red base for Brett Kavanaugh. You have some Democratic senators now in these precarious re-election positions. Is it possible that this issue is firing up conservatives more than Democrats and could backfire come the midterms?
Well, I don't want this to be about politics, and I worked as a prosecutor. I want this to be about people who are assaulted feeling comfortable in any part of the country, in any state, red state or blue state, that they can come forward and they're not going to be demeaned or have their motives questioned, and that real investigations, whether it's a job interview or a criminal investigation, will take place.
Let me ask you about another story that's making big headlines today, and that's this New York Times investigation. We keep calling it epic because it is, looking into the president, these questionable schemes on taxes, the money that he made. You overnight said this shows that the president was born into privilege, basically. He's not this self-made man. So let me push it forward. What should Congress do? If Democrats take back the House, would you support, for example, making a move to try to get the president's tax returns, doing more on this?
The American people deserve to know if their president is a cheat. And this president, it's really about credibility. He told a lot of people that he was successful. And if he lied about that, how can they believe that he will help make them successful? So the House Ways and Means Committee can actually subpoena the chairman can ask for the records by law. Treasury would have to turn over the president's tax records. The Republicans can put this to bed by just doing that today. The president could put this to bed by allowing that to happen, but he won't. So I think it may take a Democratic majority in January.
Do you think that'll fire up the voters, fire up Democratic voters?
Well, again, I don't want it to be about politics. I think it should just be about no one is above the law. This is something that Democratic and Republican presidents have done, and we should know, what he has done in the past, especially with credible allegations that fraud was committed.
Extremely quickly here, Rod Rosenstein is at the White House right now for a previously scheduled meeting, we're told. Our producers watched him walk in. He is set to meet with House Republicans, I believe, next week to talk about this report that he was talking about, the 25th Amendment, et cetera. You're a Democrat. Are you going to be there? Do you expect to be at that meeting? Are Democrats invited?
We're trying to get into the meeting.
But you're not invited yet?
We're not invited right now.
Okay.
And again, that's a shame. And to have a one-sided meeting with Rod Rosenstein, again, to try and, I think, direct, the investigation is improper. Firing Rod Rosenstein to me is the same as firing Bob Mueller. I think most of my colleagues view it that way. That'd be committing obstruction of justice in plain sight. And it would just be, Exhibit D, for, I think, investigation that'll take place in January.
Rod Rosenstein, of course, the Deputy Attorney General who oversees the special counsel investigation. Congressman Swalwell, thank you for coming on
Thanks,
set.
Holly.
I appreciate it. Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel. Why don't you subscribe? It's really easy. Just click on that button down there. And for more news from MSNBC, click on any of these videos here for the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more videos from MSNBC with our newsletters. Head over to msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up.